I'm Justin.
I'm Marius.
I'm Kay.
And this is ComicsVerse. Thank you for listening to another episode of the ComicsVerse Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Justin Alba, ComicsVerse CEO. I am joined by a lovely panel of co-hosts today, starting with the Kay Honda. Kay, how are you?
I'm doing great.
We should introduce the concept of today's podcast, which is an interview with Mr. Rick Remender, and you were the first person to ever tell me about Rick Remender.
I guess I was. I will take full responsibility for that amazing feat.
You should. So what are you most excited about for today's interview?
I'm really just excited to hear his whole thought process and how he approaches life.
What makes Rick Remender tick?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm with you.
Pick his brain a little bit.
Right. And also joining me is Mr. Matthew Murphy, the host of the Longbox podcast.
Ooh,
Yes.
check that
Also,
out too.
The host of another podcast, I think, coming out soon.
We're working on a little something.
We're working on a little
Okay.
something. Matt, what was your first experience with Rick Remender comics?
My first experience with Rick Remender was his Venom book. The co-host of the Longbox podcast, Tyler, was like, you got to read this book. It's the most insane thing I've ever read in my entire life. And he got my mom to pick it up for me for Christmas. And ever since then, I've been picking up his Marvel stuff, but I'm really into his Image stuff right now. Thematically, I think he's one of the most brilliant writers we have in the industry right now.
The other person responsible for my love of Rick Remender is Marius Thienenkamp. Wait, was that better?
That was so good. I was just gonna mention that you're getting better at pronouncing my name from episode to episode.
Thank you. And it's something that I practice all the time. And what a lot of people don't know, Marius, is that you were here most recently for the last series of podcasts. This is the first podcast that we've taped since you've been gone from New York.
Yes.
Now that you're back in Germany. And Marius, thank you so much for getting me into UNCANNY X-FORCE and UNCANNY Avengers.
I know, right? Like when we first met 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago. It's been 1.5 years ago. However, I remember us talking like a lot, and I don't really think I've met such a big X-Men fan before. So I was really surprised when I heard that you had never actually read the Rick Remender run on UNCANNY X-FORCE, and I'm so glad that I got you to read that, and we did 2 podcasts and a segment on the FX podcast about it, and now we're doing an interview with Rick Remender. So yeah, I'm really excited.
Before we get to Rick Remender, it's a great time to remind everyone that you need to go to comicsverse.com, check out our website, check out our podcasts, check out our videos. We just went to New York Comic Con. Actually, not just by the time you guys listen to this, it'll be pretty far after that, but we have some awesome interviews from New York Comic Con, including we got Charles Soule, we got Chris Claremont from FlameCon. Kay has Phil Jimenez and Simon Graves, and who else did you have? FlameCon?
Kevin Wada.
So we're getting ready for Rick Remender, and again, check out comicsverse.com.
Get ready for a good time, guys.
All right, Rick, thank you so much for sitting down with us, and if it's all right with you, we're going to start this segment with asking you about you as an artist. And
as an artiste.
As an artiste, as an auteur, as we say at ComicsVerse often.
Yes, well, yes. Let's get up into my ass.
That was kind of the best response to auteur I've ever heard so far in this podcast history, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Just
so.
Climb up there and stay there, I guess.
The funny thought was I'm like, well, this will definitely be one where we don't curse.
Yeah, just kidding.
Yeah, it's cool. It's going to happen, right?
Do you guys want me to not curse? I didn't know.
You
No.
can do whatever you want.
No, usually it gets pretty rowdy.
It gets rowdy. Yeah, we have a curse sound.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're good.
All
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, if you curse, the Phoenix sound from X-Men the Animated Series will play over it.
That's not my generation. I was by the time that cartoon came out, the 90s ruined the X-Men. As a child of the 80s, I was not a fan.
That's fair.
Yeah, I was just coming around. I was late 80s, early 90s. Anyway, back to podcast. Anyway, I was going to say, I think it's apparent to anyone who reads your work what a talented writer you are. So my first question to you is, why comics? What is it about the comics medium that speaks to you?
I found comic books around the same time that I found punk rock and skateboarding. I was about 11 years old. And they all three put their hooks in me, and I sort of found the things that I loved, and it led to the art scenes, that I fell in love with, and cultural and musical, and to me, comic, as a child of the 80s, comic books and punk rock and skateboarding were kind of the best of it all. And so as I got older, I couldn't get rid of it. I sold my comic collection when I was 16 because I was too cool. I'm done with that. But then by the time I was 18, I was just back to replenishing the same shit that I had just sold a few years earlier. And then I got a job at a comic book store that I managed for a couple, 2-3 years while I saved up enough money to go to the Joe Kubert School.
Oh, wow.
And then went to the Kubert School for a month and came back to Phoenix because I had a girlfriend that I thought was way more important because I was, 20, and that's what you do.
Yeah.
And then got very fortunate that Don Bluth and Fox
Wow.
Animation opened up where I grew up in Phoenix. So they hired me as an animator's assistant where I was taught to animate. And but even that didn't make me happy. I spent my nights making comic books. Me and some pals that I met at the studio. I just couldn't get I couldn't get rid of the bug. And so as life went on and I got older, I kept getting good jobs. I would get jobs in animation or storyboarding for, I worked at Warner Brothers and Electronic Arts, and I had a great job there. And then I was offered just one good job after another. And I kept quitting them to make comic books for nothing, which if that isn't a sickness, I don't know what is. And so, in an industry that didn't have much representation in terms of genre stuff or female leads that represented the kind of, people that I knew in my life. I developed books like Nightmare and Strange Girl, which had, interesting female leads, but based on humans that I knew instead of just chicks in bio armor with huge tits that were almost exposed. I, worked with friends to make Fear Agent to try to make some pulpy science fiction and worked on numerous horror comics and the stuff that I thought comics needed more of to survive. Instead of just the same ongoing repeating soap opera of the superhero world.
Word.
And the more I did it, I started making books that I felt were pretty good. And the more you do that, the deeper the art form sunk its teeth into me until, it was all consuming. And then, the bottom line is that even when people weren't reading the books, I was still making, 2 or 3 comics a month. Either writing and drawing or writing or drawing or, inking one, drawing one, writing another. And most of that time I had to, storyboard or teach or animate or do any number of full-time day jobs to pay the bills. But my nights and weekends were still consumed with making comic books. And so to answer your question, the longest possible self-indulgent version I could give you, the purity of intention and the creative liberties and freedom of making creator-owned comic books are satisfying to me in a way that very few things in life are. And so I enjoy doing it and have thrown my entire life at it for so long. I can't imagine any other way of living.
It's amazing. So
Okay, well, that's the end of the podcast. Bye. What? That was the best response and very thorough, I think. And I mean,
I'd never heard such a positive origin story going into comics before.
Yeah.
Everything else is usually miserable, starving artist, and it's just like I worked really hard and I earned it.
Right.
That was super positive.
Well, yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to skip over the misery. There was plenty of that. You're talking to Rick Remender at 43, who people buy his comics now, and he can support his family with them. Rick Remender at 33 and 23, he had different songs to sing to you. It was very, very frustrating to, there was years that I would make 5-6 graphic novels worth of material that I was very proud of, and nobody cared. Or the ideas would then get literally stolen by, a company and used layouts that I did and for things like Sea of Red. You just have to sit in obscurity and keep toiling and making the books. And those years were very hard and I was very bitter. And, there was by 2007, when I'd been doing it for a full decade, and I'd learned how to pencil and ink and write and animate and storyboard and really just killed myself to try to learn how to do all these things. I was pretty broken. And fortunately, it was just around the corner when people would decide that they would like to maybe pay me to read my comic books. And then that made things a lot better for sure.
I mean, I'm just floored by the fact that, because I wasn't the same level of animator, but I'm familiar with how labor intensive animation can be and how, especially if you do hand-drawn animations. I mean, obviously digital is difficult too, but that is so labor intensive. And the fact that you were saying that even after a full-time job of that, at night you found not only energy, but you had the passion to keep making these comics as well is crazy to me. Because, I barely have like energy to bathe myself after like a part-time job, and that's just like I can't even imagine being so immersed in something like that.
It's crazy. It's a crazy thing, you know. And I tell people who want to make it in comics, not everybody has to pay the amount of dues I paid. Not everybody has to put in that many years working that many different jobs and learning that many aspects of the craft of making, you know, comic books and cartoons. I had a long road to it, but the purity of intention and the satisfaction of making a book out of thin air with your friends, and then each book you make gets better, and you're watching yourself learn, and you're watching the artists get better, and you're you know, working on something like Fear Agent, and issue by issue watching Jerome Opeña get better and better as we were building that thing, and watching his talent grow and grow was so satisfying. And at the same time, it challenges you, and you're having to hone your craft, and every comic you make, you're learning something new on, and that is an addictive aspect to this art form.
So I was wondering when you usually write. I think I was just listening to George R.R. Martin the other day saying that, man, I cannot write on planes. I have all these speaking engagements. It's going to be a while till I finish my next book. So I kind of wanted to ask you about your process. Where do you usually write? Is it at home? Do you go to a coffee shop? Do you kind of have ideas going on all the time? It's kind of a lot of questions all in one. And then also sort of where do you get inspiration from? And if you're not feeling the inspiration, where do you go to get it?
I work at home. I have an office out of the house, but I haven't really been able to use it that much. I had a studio in San Francisco for 10 years with friends. When I was working, a lot of my time also was spent drawing, at which point we can listen to funny podcasts, radio shows, we can talk, we can watch movies. But now that I've become full-time writer McGillicuddy, I don't really have that track, you know, like my input track is turned off a lot of the time. I have, you know, hundreds of gigabytes of instrumental music and post-rock and shoegaze and soundtrack because I can't really have lyrics playing when I'm writing. In order to get a deep immersion, I need hours to be left alone with no phone calls. So when I'm very productive, I'm usually up until 4 a.m. when in the quiet hours and typing. But of course, then I'm sleeping until noon, and I become very unhealthy. So these days, I'm getting up at 8 a.m. and going to bed at 12, but my productivity falls off because I'm interrupted all day. There's email, there's phone calls, there's human children that I created with my wife that I love very much. And the human children want time, and so all of these things kind of contribute to making it quite difficult to get that flow. And I also can't write on planes. I can write outlines, and if I'm really crunched, I can do it. If it's a real heavy deadline, I can write it on a plane. I can write when I'm traveling, but usually it's better if I'm at home and I need to know it's uninterrupted. I need like 8 hours so that mentally I know once I'm deep in the script, I'm not going to get pulled out. Yeah, very, very delicate, sensitive artist with all sorts of like, you know, accommodation rules for my process. And, you know, not to sound like, you know, a prima donna about it, but it's about immersion for me, and that takes time and quiet.
Well, that's interesting because, like, it seems like from what you're telling us, you appreciate your relationships with other artists or having like a group community, but then you also need that space to yourself to create. So just to lead into the next question, one of the things that you're well known for as a writer is working with artists you've had a long relationship with. 2 names that we have down or that come to mind are, I'm probably going to butcher their names, the poor people, Greg Tocchini and Jerome Opeña. I think you said his last name and I missed it because I'm awful. And of course,
Tocchini and Opeña.
Yeah, Tocchini and Opeña. So like there are plenty of others that you've had close relationships with. Like as a storyteller, do you think that these friendships or work relationships that you've made with your creative partners has improved your work through the years? I think you answered this a little bit, but if you can go in depth with that.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons that I wanted to make comics was I wanted to work with friends and create things. I didn't want to work in a conveyor belt where I do script and then that gets moved down the conveyor belt to an artist who then moves down to the conveyor belt to the colorist who moves down to the conveyor belt to the letterer. I wanted all of us talking and sharing ideas and excited about the work, or else why wake up in the morning and do it? Right. So as I've moved through my career, many of the creator-owned projects I've done, the people that I've done them with, I've become friends with, and we feed on each other's creativity, and we become not inseparable. Obviously, Tokini and Opeña and Wes and Mateo and all the wonderful people that I've worked with, work well with other people, but I think that for me, as I discover these people who are wonderful storytellers and incredible artists, and also incredible people who I like to talk story on the phone with, and we're passionate about what we're creating, that makes the job pleasant and it makes my life enjoyable. And so, like Tokini, he speaks Portuguese, and we met the first time at Chicago a year or two ago, and we just silently kind of sat there smiling at each other and grunting and showing artwork. And he's the sweetest guy in the world, and he's just such an amazing artist. But we collaborate through poorly translated emails and scripts, and the result is a very different product than it is with like somebody like Wes Craig, who we get on the phone and talk things out a lot.
Right.
The process with Greg is more like, oh, I wrote this and it's, Greg did this and it's pretty close. Oh, I got an idea. And then I'll change things to fit the art, and then he'll change things. And we end up kind of collaborating in the strangest ways. But what comes out of it is so unique and so ultimately, could only be us in the way we are doing it. So I think for me, it's camaraderie, it's community. It's continuity of relationships that lead to, like, Jerome and I have an unspoken language. Jerome and I have been working on comics together for 10 years now. So Jerome and I I don't sweat things. He doesn't sweat things. We talk it out. We know what we're going for. It's the same way he'll design things that weren't quite how I saw them, but they're better and more interesting. And then I'll tweak the story to kind of fit that. And it's all about knowing the personalities and the people and the everybody having their space while still allowing that sort of ebb and flow of creation.
Okay. My next question was about whether you choose or you approach specific artists dependent on what you were considering, like very specific accommodations that you would want as a writer or like as a creative person to work with another person. But since you kind of answered that with how organic your creative relationships and friendships are, we can skip that.
All right.
Just skip it. That's all.
Rick, my question for you is, we've spoken about your work in animation. What I'm wondering is, you worked on animated films like Iron Giant, video games like Bulletstorm. You're a multimedia creator. Are there challenges going from one medium to the next? Yeah,
learning the formatting of anything you're working on and keeping it in mind, like, when I was writing Dead Space or Bulletstorm, the video game stuff is different because they're not going to twist the whole game around for your story. So it's a lot of give and take. It's a lot of story-wise, I want to get from here to here, but gameplay, they have this happening. And so it's all about being flexible. And flexibility is ultimately the thing that will help you survive any of this. You might have a story that's 15 issues in mind in a comic. The artist can only do 10. You're going to have to gut a bunch of that story and be flexible and figure it out. If you're working in a video game and they have some aspect of the story that doesn't jibe with the story you were telling, you figure out how to make it fit because the gameplay is going to come first in a video game. And at the same time, on things like Dead Space, I would pitch ideas like zero gravity or spaceships colliding with the station. There's big things you pitch in the story document that actually make it into the game. And then for things like, screenwriting, I wrote screenplays for XXX Zombies and Last Days of American Crime. And now I'm working on the Deadly Class TV show, as well as a couple of other TV shows. That screenwriting is a very different thing where you have to spend more time thinking about all manner of foundation rules and up and down beats and the structure and the act breaks. But you also have to consider how the dialogue sounds as opposed to how it reads. There's a bit of dialogue that'll read very nicely, but when it's spoken, it might sound a little unnatural. And so what I do is there's a part of final draft that'll read back dialogue. And so I'll play it back and actually hear the dialogue read back to me and go, oh, that perfectly worked if it was just printed in text or prose. It doesn't quite work when read aloud. And so there's all kinds of different craft aspects and fine-tuning things that you do depending on what the writing is for.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, when you have these kind of sort of episodes of immersion, as you were kind of talking about, how much time are you spending, when you're immersed in these characters, thinking about their circumstances versus kind of just getting into their heads? Or do you do one or the other or sort of both at the same time?
I have a buffer period that's a bummer. So like today, for example, this morning I worked on the Deadly Class TV show pilot for 5 hours. And then I took lunch and then went to the gym and came home, and I was supposed to then start working on a Black Science thing that I wanted to pick away at. And I have a very hard time switching gears in one day from one project to the next, so I try to break it out where I don't do that. And even when I do, I usually have a day, maybe 2 days between projects before I fully kind of fall back into the other story.
Wow.
So on a day like, this week I've spent a lot of time in Deadly Class and 7 to Eternity. It's going to take me a few days before I can start getting my head into Grant McKay and what he's up to in Black Science. Fortunately, I have full scripts with, scratch track dialogue, so I get the intention and I get what I was going for. But most comic books take me 3 to 5 days to rewrite the dialogue once I have the art to kind of marry them up. And I like to trim out as much as I can to make sure they're not too verbose and that I'm getting my ideas across in the most concise way possible.
Do you ever have to shake a character off when you're done writing for the day? Do you find that they stay with you until the next period of writing?
I don't know. I don't know if they stay with me. I know that a lot of the time what I'm bringing to them is what I'm dealing with in life. So they're probably trying to shake me off. I know a lot of the time that that I approach a story, what's naturally sort of on my mind or upsetting me or making me happy or interesting me or kind of ends up getting dumped into whatever character I'm writing through the spectrum of who that character is. And it's always an interesting sort of challenge in that, like, if I'm frustrated with something I'm reading about in the world, I want to write about that, obviously. That's on my mind. And so I shine that light through the filter of a character, but then have to consider, how does that character see it more than just how I see it? You don't want to just make every character your mouthpiece for whatever you're going through. So the opinion might completely change on how it's being represented based on who the character is. And what it is and how I'm saying it might completely change, but I still get to tackle the topic, and so I get to flush it out of my head.
Yeah, it's like therapeutic.
Yeah, it really is, and that's one of the reasons that I wanted to be a writer.
Speaking of that, you mentioned that you have 2 human children before, and we lovingly call them Rugrats in my family. So I was kind of curious, as your kids get older, they see some of your work. What's something that you've worked on that you're like, wow, I would love for my kids to read this one day or watch this?
Well, I definitely don't write a lot of stories aimed at kids. Maybe one day. I definitely have itches to do kids' books. But I think that, when they're older, I'd like them to read, any number of the books. I work really hard on them, and I dump a lot of myself into the books. So, what'll be difficult is when they're older and reading a book like Deadly Class and processing my, some of my childhood and my adolescence and the troubling mischief that I was up to, as well as, some of the uglier aspects of that book. But yeah, but there's also, I try to fill it with so much heart and philosophy and truth that maybe they would find something to identify with that didn't feel like it was an adult pandering to kids or trying to whitewash the world into something cleaner than it actually is. Yeah, I don't know. Any of my creator-owned books have so much of me in them. It'd be nice when they're older if they wanted to read any of them, from Strange Girl to 7 to Eternity.
Yeah, I think that's really great because I know my dad is always trying to struggle to explain to me what his childhood was like and is really emphatic about getting it across to me. I think it would be cool to read something from back then that he wrote.
Yeah, I think it's difficult. Parent to child relationships and maintaining them can be really difficult for some people, and kind of identifying your parent or your kid as sharing any kind of similarity or understanding can sometimes seem impossible. So it's really interesting that you mentioned Deadly Class, because or the fact that you mentioned that you didn't want it to feel like you were pandering to a age group. It didn't feel that way. at all. It felt very personal. And I think that's probably why you've been really successful, is because every story that you've written has felt very personal. And I think that reaches people. So I think it will reach your kids when the time is right. Obviously not now. That's not right. But
No,
eventually,
that wouldn't be great.
No.
In their late 20s one day, right?
Yeah, that seems like late teens. Late teens seem like when they're allowed to read my daddy's comics. In the meantime, like, I have plenty of Marvel books that when the comics would come in, I would put them in the kids' room. And, Captain America is something I'm particularly proud of my work in. And I would give those to my son and my daughter, and they really enjoyed them. So I've got all my Marvel stuff to give the kids now so that they can kind of, see some of what I do. And, I appreciate the compliment. One thing that was always writing to me is a privilege, and it's something that I'm very fortunate to be able to express myself and have people interested in it. And it's a privilege and an honor, and it truly is, in a way that I take quite seriously. And I wanted to make sure every book I ever made was my best foot forward. And more than that, was painfully honest in a way that people might even find something that they identified with and felt like they weren't alone. Because for me, those were always the best, the best books and movies and music always made me feel like this complex, strange part of me was reflected out of another person. It made me feel a little bit less of it, like an alien.
Yeah, like someone gets it, which I think is pretty cool. So before we break into the Marvel segment, what's coming up on the horizon for you? And is there anything, and also, where do you prefer our audience to go to learn more about you and pick up some of your work?
My work should be, available in most bookstores. I think that each one of the books is a different flavor. I try to write from a different place and from different types of characters with different things to say. I'm very proud of any of the books, so I don't like to pick one over any of the others. All of my current creator-owned books, as well as creator-owned books like Strange Girl and Fear Agent, and things that I've really poured myself to in the past, I stand behind them, and I sell them proudly and confidently. That you might not like them, but I definitely feel that those books are my best foot forward. And as for what I have coming up, the Deadly Class TV show is in motion. There's some big news we haven't announced, and it's a very exciting time for that. I've got a couple of other TV shows I'm working on with some of my current projects. There's a lot of exciting potential in other media for the books. And more than anything, just trying to fight out making unique and loved comic books that are created by the people who own them and given the very best that we have to give them at Image these days, and to keep them coming out. We did hit a point in time where our attention spans are shortening. And so I always liked a story that I could dig into and it would go 20, 30, 40 issues. And so that's what we are working hard to do, and keep the quality up.
You're doing a great job.
Absolutely. And people can check out your stuff on rickremender.com, right? They
can, yes. That is the easiest place right now.
Awesome.
Because wouldn't you know it, he draws too. He does everything.
So let's move into some Marvel stuff. As you know, we recently did that UNCANNY X-FORCE podcast. Would you like to talk a bit about how it was you came to write UNCANNY X-FORCE? I always wondered if these were characters that you chose to work with, or Marius, sorry, you're in Google Docs and your name is over where I'm reading. It's okay. Anyway, I always wondered if these were characters you chose to work with, or if the cast was predetermined from the X-FORCE series that preceded your run.
I was convinced that the way I wanted to make comic books wouldn't work at Marvel. I had done The Punisher on a run with some friends, and Tony Moore and Jerome Pena and Dan Brereton and Roland Boschi, and it had some of the best art that I've ever been associated with, and it was a heartfelt, unique take on a boring character. And fans weren't. There was a large vocal bit of the fan base that really hated the idea of what we had done, turning Frank Castle into a monster who was protecting the population of Monster Metropolis. And I get that. It's far from the purity of the angry dude who's murdering criminals, but I kind of hate that, I guess. I kind of think that's some antiquated bullshit. And so we dumped ourselves into The Punisher and Frankencastle, and to this day, it's one of the things I'm absolutely the most proud of in my career. But, the fans were screaming, yeah, understand the Punisher. I'm like, yeah, I do understand the Punisher, but Garth Ennis already did this as well as anybody's going to, and I'm not going to write more of that. I'm not going to write more of Frank Castle killing Russian, heroin dealers, or, killing a Puerto Rican guy for selling a dime bag, or whatever the Frank Castle does. And so we did something that was unique and strange and outlandish, and the people who loved it really loved it. And that's always the sign that I've done something that works in my mind. And the people who hated it really hated it. That's kind of what you want. But I was of a mind that was it for me at Marvel. And they were developing another X-Force series. And at the time, X-Force, Punisher, Venom, these are sort of relics of things that were really big in the 90s, but didn't really have a perch in modern, in the modern landscape. They're definitely not the books I was, as a kid of the 80s, this was like being handed not what I wanted. I liked those things okay, but they definitely didn't scratch an itch. But then Axel who was running the X-Men office at the time, he and the team had put together this X-Force book, and he told me it would be Wolverine and Deadpool and Archangel and Psylocke and Phantom X. Mm-hmm. And if I asked if I wanted to pitch on it. And I said, well, yeah, I do. Because a lot of those characters I could ground in the Chris Claremont lore that I was cooked in as a kid, from Betsy. Phantom X is obviously Grant Morrison, who I consider second only to the Chris stuff. I think what Grant did is fantastic and imaginative and additive and substantive, to go with another Iv. But I think that, in digging in that, I then, Deadpool was never like my thing, but I thought that, maybe this is my opportunity to try and infuse that character with a humanity that hasn't necessarily been reflected in that character a lot. And he would be the voice of ethical reason in this X-Force team. And that all kind of tickled me and made me get excited about it. So I pitched on it. I wrote up a bunch of different documents, and I got the job, sort of expecting that my morality play would be something that, the fans booed and hissed at, and was pleasantly surprised. I was very fortunate that Jerome Opeña was able to join me on that. He was exclusive at Marvel, and they had decided to move him away from me on Moon Knight, and they were going to move us away again. And I had a long conversation with Axel and basically pleaded to, quit breaking us up and let me work with Jerome on this. And he agreed, and he assigned Dean White to it, which was a great fit. And so we went off and made the book, and it worked out. I think that for me, it was nice to get to sort of spit out some of my love for those characters that I had spent so much of my youth with, and to take an idea, which is an X-Men team that are murderers, which I kind of hate. I kind of hate that idea. I mean, I don't kind of hate it. I hate that idea. Oh, they're extreme. They're the X-Men, but they kill you. And like, oh, get the out of here with that shit. And I was able to sort of take that and make a comment on capital punishment, and make a comment on the ugliness of what they were up to and how that all worked, while digging into what I got lucky that it worked out in a way that it allowed me to show the beating heart of what I loved about the X-Men during the Claremont and Grant Morrison era. And I think there was a lot of other people out there who had read those runs and missed that aspect of the X-Men.
I think I can speak for everyone here in saying that those are our two favorite eras.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it started from X-Men, this whole thing, ComicsVerse and everything.
Yeah.
So it's amazing that it's very validating to hear that from Rick Remender.
No, absolutely. And it's funny because when I was writing the script for the podcast, when we were doing Uncanny X-Force, I remember this line where I think it was Wolverine was explaining that kind of the world needed X-Force. There needed to be this team of people to kill. And it's funny that your response was what it was, because I couldn't help but to think that these characters needed X-Force more than the world did, because they seem to have this like kind of killer instinct or hunger for violence that couldn't be satiated any other way. And I was hoping you could speak to that, if that's even true.
Well, that was one of the aspects of Wolverine that was always something that Chris did a wonderful job of exploring, and something that I tried to continue with the X-Force. And as well as characters like Betsy, who, the original Betsy, when it was steeped in all of that Captain Britain stuff, she wasn't a samurai sword wielding Elektra clone. And at some point in the early 90s, Claremont and Jim Lee turned her into Elektra, and she became more popular. Look, I mean, a lot of these things are born out of following trends. Archangel is, you can read Walt Simonson talk about, like, nobody liked Angel, and I did the worst thing I could have, and I turned him into Wolverine. But people then liked it. There were kids had taste that, very questionable. But so the challenge then is to take those characters that, have that instinct and do things that are kind of rotten, and to really examine superheroes and people who are supposed to, help the world taking on such extreme measures. And, the idea that Wolverine is going to, kill somebody, so it might as well be aimed at the right place, or that Deadpool's, if he's going to be a mercenary, at least be hired by Warren Worthington, so the X-Men are pointing him at, pointing his swords at things.
Right.
It made them at least more palatable to me as characters, that instinct was being pointed at places. But then ultimately, I just wanted to show how f***ed up that instinct was. And okay, here's the next apocalypse growing, and so go ahead and use your murder, clean up the problem with a murder, and then just knock dominoes down from that moment for the next 30 issues.
That's so interesting. My next question kind of goes into that, and I mean, you mentioned that already, kind of your like morality play in the book, and in general, like this theme of moral dilemmas that these characters are faced with. First off, I mean, you kind of got into that, but you, like in the book, you assemble a cast that's really like rough around the edges, and that's not exactly afraid of killing. Was it any challenging to kind of push these characters to their moral boundaries?
I think the challenge with a character like Deadpool was to give him a beating heart and to actually establish some moral boundaries. And Phantom X, who was the man of mystery, to kind of find a motivation for him and to show what his dilemmas were. And for Betsy, who had been this sort of, to take all the continuity and all the mess that character had gone through and to tie it into something that made some kind of sense as a human being enduring that and what she came out of. And obviously Archangel, to take a classic X-Men and Warren Worthington and examine this infestation. And then I came up with the idea that Archangel, the infestation, is an infestation to be the next caretaker of evolution, to be the next apocalypse type figure. And you write all these knowing that the next team of people are going to come in and ignore it, and that there's going to be a whole mess. So I tried to write something that was self-contained enough that it could stand on its own merits, and ultimately, hopefully, you have a story where you cared about the characters, even though what they were doing was very questionable and ugly, and you saw them as an examination of what happened to the culture of comic books when nice, good, heroic characters became boring to people and they had to become killers. That was really what I kind of latched onto and was the most interesting part to write.
All right, moving on from this. We did talk a lot about this in our podcast. We actually have an ethics podcast coming up in the next few weeks, I guess, where we also get into kind of like your first story arc, the Apocalypse Solution, which you just mentioned, and how that, at least in our opinion, like really effectively works as a metaphor for problems in moral philosophy, such as the trolley problem. And I don't know if this is like overinterpretation on our end, but reading your run on Uncanny X-FORCE, many positions that characters would take seemed like typical utilitarian or typical deontological. So I don't know. It just seemed like you dealt a lot with moral philosophy preparing to write the book. Is that the case? Is that kind of like, was that your intention?
Yeah, not just for this book. I mean, as the saying goes, punk rock changed my life. And the ethics and the thought, the thinking that goes into, and the passion that goes into punk rock music demands questioning not only authority, not only questioning the world you live in, but questioning your own perspective and your own side of the fence, which is something that we've kind of lost as a society now. Now we all sit there, and if anybody disagrees with us, they're naturally idiots, and we hate them, and we throw ugly names at them. We no longer have nuanced debate or listen to what people say. And punk rock taught me, and growing up steeped in all that wonderful music, to more than anything to question And a lot of what I did there in X-Force was questioning through the lens of these superheroes and this 1990s idea that was just sort of salacious and mindless, was to then take that and try to say something about the world with it. And that's a challenge I take with any book. I try to say something, be it, the validity of artificial intelligence and Secret Avengers, to the Uncanny Avengers is just a morality play as well, dealing with if left and right can't find a way to get together, the world's going to end. With any of these things, I'm trying to write from a philosophical point of view with some voice and something to say that, examines both sides of an issue.
I have a short question about your Captain America stuff, if that's okay.
Sure.
So, what I kind of realized is that both in your Uncanny Avengers run, but also in your Captain America run, there are very brief moments where Steve is kind of facing these villains that criticize what he stands for and the concept he's standing for. And they point out all kinds of possible flaws in capitalism, patriotism, and the American dream. I was always interested in your intention. Do you think that these American comics and American comics about American icons can be a good platform to voice these concerns? What was that your intention?
Well, yeah, it definitely was my intention. I think that all concepts and ideas must be questioned and poked at and discussed. And I think that deep debate between these characters is much more interesting than painting one as right and one as wrong. That's the problem with the modern thinking, be it left or right. We all think that we are correct, and in our hearts it's true, and the idiots on the other side are idiots, and them. And so to discuss ideas and discuss nuance, this is something that Captain America felt like a wonderful opportunity to do that, to not just have a Red Skull who was like, I'm evil and I'm going to shit on the world, but to have a Red Skull who had a position. And his position was that, your capitalistic democracy has lost the debate. Your culture is in the toilet, and look around your country. The devolution and the idiocracy is happening. And in terms of a character like the Iron Nail, who was who was intended to be Mao's Red Skull. So where Hitler had the Red Skull, Mao had the Iron Nail, and this guy had worked with a communist regime, but that he wasn't painted as a 2D caricature of somebody who was just, he's a bad guy, but might have actually presented arguments about holes in the American way of life and things that might make people think. And that's sort of the challenge with any of that stuff, is not just to write more soap opera or meaningless conflict or do the worst pandering thing you can do, which is just to stand on your soapbox and preach at people about what your point of view is. I always try and write both sides and both points of view to the best of my abilities, so that neither one seem perfectly right, because neither side is ever perfectly right.
That's so true. That's a great answer. All right, Justin, do you think we should continue with the word association game?
Yeah, but at first I wanted to, I had a question I was going to ask about the end of Uncanny X-FORCE, but I think it's too long of a question. But I did want to say that I now refer to that type of flash forward as a Rick Remender flash forward. And I have to say, that was it? We were counting, and I think that's the 7th comic I've cried at. Nick made fun of me for crying at comics all the time, but he was wrong, because I've just cried at X-23 so many times they thought I'd cried at a comic. But you made me tear, and I have to say, I was never a Betsy and Warren fan until I read this. So thank you very much for getting me on the Betsy and Warren train.
Well, their relationship was a short-lived blip in the 90s. So Really it was about taking that bit of continuity and then building on it. And it seemed to make a lot of sense, given that Warren was fighting this infestation of evil, that Betsy and he would be together, but it would also be this strangely unhealthy dynamic where she was a necessary component to keep him human. And that's the kind of strain on a relationship that gives a lot of potential for wonderful drama, I found. So I'm glad when people cared about that relationship. Ultimately, that relationship, breaking that relationship was a lot of fun for me to do, because the whole time I had always planned on Phantom X being the next natural conclusion for Betsy, and I got to give them a happy ending before I left, and it felt like they were the beating heart of that story for sure, the three of those and that love triangle.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was just telling this to, was it Kay I was telling this to, or was it Marius, that like every word in that flash forward seemed like it like broke my heart, and it seemed like it was so perfectly chosen. So yeah, I absolutely loved it. Marius, why don't you go ahead with the word association, and then we can move on to Kay's segment.
All right. So what we're gonna do, we've done this on podcasts before with, for instance, Chris Claremont. It's usually really fun. So what we're gonna do is a quick game of word association where we're gonna read out character names to you, and you just name the first word that comes to your mind thinking about this character. All right?
Okay.
You ready?
Yeah, let's give it a shot.
All right. Archangel.
Damaged.
Psylocke.
Messy.
Deadpool.
Farty.
Wait, are you describing us, or no? I'm kidding. Oh, Marius, I talked over.
I've already self-censored on that one, so it doesn't work anymore.
No.
All right. It's all right. We can move on to the next one. What about Kid Apocalypse or Genesis?
Proud Edition, I suppose.
All right. What about Age of Apocalypse Jean?
Wonderful way of using a dead character.
I want to ask about Polaris too, because I noticed Havoc and Wasp ended up being a couple in Uncanny Avengers. What do you think of her?
Well, I never read. I mean, I know a lot of people were saying that the Peter David stuff was really great. To me, Polaris was a character that Claremont always tried to make work and never really stuck. Then I saw Wasp. I saw Janet is such a strong character that Janet's always more interesting, got a better history. And I thought that if there was an X-Man and an Avenger, that those two seemed like such a strange pairing, given Alex's relationship, and his connection to Scott and all that stuff. It seemed more interesting than just continuing on the tried and true path.
Very cool. All right, that does it for that. And I'll let Kay move on and start asking some image stuff. I'm going to get out of your hair.
All right, cool. Thank you, Rick. Obviously, it's been a pleasure so far. We won't keep you up for too long. We just wanted to talk about some of your image works, Matt and I. So we wanted to talk about some of the themes that we noticed in your works, like Deadly Class, Tokyo Ghost, Low, and I think the other one, Seven to Infinity? Yeah. So we were just wanting to go over some of the themes. I guess to start off, we were going to go, one of the questions was a little bit more specific to Deadly Class because we're both really big fans of it. At the end of the arc 4 of Deadly Class, the main characters of the series, Marcus was killed off by Saya, and
all right, I'm gonna move forward with my question because Kay's a little lost. But one of the themes that I noticed in your work, licensed and creative owned, was the responsibility of fatherhood. We've seen it in Wolverine and Uncanny X-Force, Grant McKay in Black Science, and as recently as Adam in Seven to Eternity. Can you talk about why fatherhood is such a personal thing for you that you keep coming back to it in your work?
There's any number of other aspects. It's really family. I mean, just the same as like Low is more about motherhood but yeah, there's obviously been a lot of fatherhood stuff. A lot of the books that I've written in the past 5 years and 7 years have been written since I've been a father. And having kids is something that's been a fairly profound experience. And so examining that from all these different angles has been, write what you know and write what you're going through. And a lot of the time that comes through. In other cases, it's a matter of, it's just writing. It's just, you want a family connection has more context and more emotional heart. And it won't necessarily be something where I'm personally dealing with anything. But I've also got, a pretty tumultuous childhood and some things that I endured as a kid that I'm working through in some of those stories. A lot of the in Fear Agent, there's a little bit. I think there's a lot of it in the Flash Thompson Venom. I think that character and what he had been through kind of lent itself to exploring some of that in some of those earlier issues. Captain America and his struggle raising a son in Dimension Z, and then Grant McKay and his utter failing of his family is obviously sort of writing a cautionary tale of a failed father who prioritized work even though it was important and lost his family. In something, that's an interesting thing to write about as something to avoid at all costs, and is a great fear of mine and something that I go to great lengths to not become. And so you write these various interactions from different places. And then, plenty of the stories I've written have none of that. There's obviously none of that in most of the Marvel work. There's obviously none of that in Strange Girl. She's dealing with more theological questions of identity and Low is all about motherhood and the perseverance and optimism of one mother. And Deadly Class doesn't really deal with parents much. That more deals with
loss,
sociological interpersonal dynamics, and honest snapshot of the ugliness of the teenage years. In Tokyo Ghost, there's no parents, there's no mother or father figures, and that's just about a codependent relationship and addiction. So, they've all got different things, but, I think for books like, Black Science and Captain America and Venom, I definitely dug into that stuff a little bit.
Well, it's interesting because, sorry, I had a brain fart earlier, but I noticed something when reading Low, Deadly Class, and Tokyo Ghost. A recurring theme that seems to come up, whether purposeful or not, is the fear of the future, or kind of this anxiety about general responsibility and how we take care of each other or how we protect each other and the nature and environment. And to counterpoint that, there's also a theme of kind of how distracting or how elusive or some things can be very, some things that are very pleasurable, like that you can use as escapism, like, sex or drugs or technology, comes up as like an illusion of reality in all three of these series. Is that something that you consciously go into, or is that something that you just personally have been maybe not experiencing, but kind of concerned about when writing those?
No, yeah, it's very much on the forefront of my mind, and it was even before I became a father, but it's definitely been magnified since I've become a parent. The reality of what's happening with the environment is catastrophe,
right.
And we all go about our business arguing online over meaningless bullshit while the world is collapsing, and
right.
We deny it, we pretend it's not happening, but it is. And that stuff is it definitely percolates in the background of my head at all times. So, something like Tokyo Ghost, that's definitely, born out of that and born out of that fear. And as well as seeing, being old enough now to have watched culture change to where we've become sort of mindless idiots looking at our phones all the time and addicted to the endorphin rush of checking emails and Twitters and Instagrams and Tumblrs and Flumblrs and, all these things that we go do all day long. When we used to slow down and immerse ourselves in things and read books and have long, meaningful conversations or call each other on the phone, now we just try to get it across in a text as quickly as possible.
Right.
And there's a consequence. There's a connective consequence, and there's a societal consequence. And so that book is a lot of me trying to, digest and process some of what that is.
Right.
And I also once had a therapist explain to me that, I'll skip that on Low because it's pretty much in the foreword. And then for the last part as to why, I think that the imagination, I had explained to me once, or I read it in an article, that imagination exists in human minds so that we can prepare for the future.
Right.
Basically, the only evolutionary reason that a tool like imagination exists is so that you can imagine next year and that you can prepare today for it. So instead of going out and shooting heroin and anybody on the street and spending all of your money, you can imagine a future where you might not want to have contracted a number of STDs, be broke, and have a heroin addiction.
Right.
And that preparing for the future, and that's why they say the older we get, maybe our imaginations begin to dwindle because there's less future to look forward to.
Right.
So that's a natural part. So obviously dystopic futures and futures that terrify me come into play and play a role in all of that, because ultimately they have been, they come out of my imagination, and my imagination is steeped in things like worrying about where my kids are going to live in 10 years or where any of us are going to be in 20 years.
But I think that that's why it's so important and interesting to hear that, coming from you, and also seeing that in your writing, because I think especially in Low, there's this idea that, there's truth and there's purity in art, or there's something beautiful about what you were saying about imagination, where, that's where hope is, that's where faith is. And I think that belief does come through very passionately in all of the series. In Deadly Class, maybe not as much in the forefront as, say, Low, but Deadly Class still has that, that hope. Like, I remember reading Marcus just being so hopeful and being, wanting to free himself from the King's Dominion school and, starting again. And it's nice to see that there's a juxtaposition between like this high anxiety about what's going to happen in the future, but then also it's tempered with this kind of purity in art and in faith and hope.
Well, I definitely try to write them all from different places and write the characters' perspective and how they deal with the worlds they're in different ways so that I can also investigate those different ideas for myself.
Right.
I had another quick question about a recurring thing. I recently read over a few of your creative-owned books before the interview, and I noticed something that I never really came across before, and it's so a lot of the male characters like Grant McKay, Led Dent, Marcus, they all share one single character trait, and that's narcissism. In your opinion, is narcissism an inherent trait for these characters? And if so, why is it so prevalent?
In Led's case, he's a narcissist out of damage and protecting himself. He's fallen into himself the way that many people do in the self-reflecting pool of the internet. Marcus, I don't think he is a narcissist. Grant, he might even apply that to himself, but I don't think Grant's a narcissist. I think Grant is somebody who, as we develop in the fourth arc and the Godworld arc and kind of dug into his character there, Grant is more someone who saw a problem with the environment. He saw, as a scientist and a genius, a way to fix that by pilfering the resources needed and the technology needed to fix it from other dimensions as the only way to protect his children. And so in Grant's mind, it's a defensible position that he threw his entire life into building a pillar so that his children would have a future. And to him, that meant more ultimately than spending time with them. But he's a child of abuse. And as a child of abuse, he expected abandonment and thus kind of moved towards fulfilling that abandonment before his family could abandon him again, like his dad did. And that abandonment issue is a big part of what happens to children of abuse. But yeah, I mean, Led's narcissism is real and definitely. I think that Marcus is arguable. What aspect of Marcus did you find as narcissistic?
I think it really came across as his relationship with Maria. It's that, and after reading the fourth arc last night, it became less as much as that he's so guarded and his defense is up that he only cares about what happens to him and he doesn't care about how his actions affect any other character.
I don't know if it's that he doesn't care. It's just that he doesn't think that he deserves anything. So he's like, he pushes anything that gives him any remote happiness away because he's like, no, I don't deserve that. Like this isn't right.
It's also a defense mechanism. He's a kid who's lost his parents and lost everything, and so he's not necessarily unempathetic or narcissistic, but he's protecting himself from damage.
I think
also, at least in my mind.
Yeah, I think that comes through because there's also an element of like you were mentioning earlier, but like we've all experienced it. Like when you're a teenager, we mentioned it in the Deadly Class podcast as well. It's like you front, like when you're that age, you're like, yeah, I'm totally a narcissistic asshole. Like totally, like pass me the PCP or whatever. Like, you just front.
Pass me the PCP.
I don't know. Just whatever life you're living.
So much of it is fronting. And so much of it is trying to perpetrate that idea that you're tough and like surviving the vicious network of adolescent cliques. That's something that a lot of us fall into, and you have to act disaffected and sort of act apathetic. And we see a lot of that with Marcus, a lot of that with Willie, in order to mask the true sort of sensitive and broken nature of who those people are.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of an awkward way to end, but I think my last question has to do with kind of whether we're going to see you write as well as pencil and do art for just like, Jeff Lemire it and just do your own comic on your own terms and do everything, since it does seem that, creator-owned comics is where it's at and you feel the most comfortable there. Is that something that you would be interested in doing in the future?
I play with it all the time. ultimately, I find that by just doing one of the jobs, by just writing, I'm able to spend more time on it and focus and dig deeper into the writing. And I think that my writing is better because of it. I think that as a true cartoonist, I would, if I was going to write and draw a book, I would have to stop doing everything else, basically.
I see. Yeah.
And then that one project would have to own all of my time and attention.
Right.
And at this point, after I write 20 pages every week, I'm so kind of addicted to that expression and that momentum. I don't know if I could go back to then looking at a story for a week as I write it, and then another 6 weeks as I draw it. Right. Looking at one story for 7, 8, 9, weeks all on my own. I don't know. I when I think about it, that sounds less desirable than writing stories for some of these guys that I'm lucky enough to work with. But who knows? Yeah, I mean, in the future when I'm older and tired, maybe.
So a soft yes. I'll say a soft yes. Maybe.
How about a huge maybe? Yeah.
Okay, a soft maybe. Okay, I'll take that. Okay. But yeah, I think that might be the end of everything. I know that you have many things to do, I'm sure, so we can conclude this lovely podcast with you.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks again for sitting down with us. We went way over time, so we really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for taking the time. It's been great.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, a lot of great questions, and I appreciate all the support and the fact you guys read the books and care enough to have the questions.
Well, thank you for being so informative.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
we hope to run into you next time you're in New York.
Yeah, perfect.
For sure. Absolutely. Thanks again. We'll chat soon.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Rick.
Bye.
I thought that was a great interview. Thank you guys so much for joining me over here, my wonderful panel.
Of course.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
What did you think was the most enlightening answer? Okay.
I don't know if he had the most enlightening answer. I think from my experience from it, I thought that it was nice to just see that all of the themes and all of the things that he addresses in his books when he writes them are, validated by him, and then also backed by like all this thought that he goes through, or like a thought process that he goes to.
Yeah, I loved how introspective he was.
Yeah, it was really, really nice, but it was super awesome.
Murphs, how about you?
I like how good of a storyteller he is. Like, we've seen it in his comics, but like getting to sit down with him, like he told us about where he came from, how he got there, each little part of what went into each book, like the Punisher story, I would have never guessed.
Right, that he hates Punisher.
Yeah, it totally blew my mind. But like he kept us engaged. He kept us wanting more.
Right.
And like it just goes to show that no matter what he's doing, he's a good storyteller.
For sure.
I feels like he would have been a great person to get a beer with and have a discussion about comics with and just talk about writing and art.
I feel like he's definitely someone who you would want to sit down and talk to, but like a general conversation about comics would soon become this like really important conversation,
like life
discussion
conversation
about like social political issues and what's wrong with culture and how we can fix it, and like
you know who can fix it?
Him.
Me.
Oh,
I thought you were going to say Donald Trump.
I was going to say Donald Trump, but then I was like, I don't want to, in case he gets sued.
And we just lost all.
Yeah, we lost. Okay, anyway.
We lost all our listeners.
Matt, what was your favorite part of the interview?
I just said it.
No, I asked, just kidding. I thought I asked you a different question. Like, I thought I asked you a more specific question. No, I guess not. Look, I don't remember.
That was it.
Okay, cool.
I think so.
All right. I have no more questions for you then. Marius, how about you? What was your favorite part of the interview?
I really like to get more into like his personal life philosophy, and I don't know, it was just interesting to see how punk rock like changed his view on things and like
that was
the
so
philosophical
interesting
approach and how we need dialogue about basically everything and in each of his books. So that was cool. But it was also interesting to find out how he basically hated so many characters he wrote about, but ended up being really good at writing them. So I mean, yes, it was really, really inspiring.
He did not like the 90s, not one bit.
No, I don't blame him though.
I always thought I was like the only person who disliked 90s X-Men.
Oh no,
but
I think most people. I mean, I was out before Onslaught came. What year was that? 94? I was born before that.
Yeah, I think so.
I was gone right after AOA.
I was born in like the early 90s, so I didn't start reading it until I got to high school.
Right.
And I didn't start appreciating it until I got to like around last year, I started really getting into like Rob Liefeld and stuff, and it's not really the content I like, it's the stylized
Right.
of the artist that I'm really into, because the content wasn't really there. It's really just how it looks that got me.
Right.
So I understand where he's coming from.
Oh, I completely do as well. And I think that, comics as a medium were definitely struggling during the 90s. And it's awesome to see how much they've bounced back in 2016. And it was awesome to hear about his upcoming TV projects from Deadly Class and
I'm
stuff.
so excited.
Yes.
That show's going to be insane.
Insane.
I don't know. Is he doing it on HBO? Like, how is he doing
Oh, my
that?
God, yes.
I hope so. That would be so dope.
I know he said there's going to be information coming soon, so that should be exciting.
Stay tuned, because we'll have that on ComicsVerse.com.
We
Get
will.
that casting, that face sheet, yo.
This would be a good time to tell you guys that I'm starring in a remake of Evita.
I don't know what that
Really?
is.
Yeah.
That's a nice
I'll
role
be
for
playing
you.
the role of the train.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big role.
I don't know what I'm talking about. I haven't seen that movie in 25 years, but cool. Anyway, I digress. Marius, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Marius.
It was a
Marius.
pleasure.
Yes.
And thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Kay.
Happy to be. I just did a princess wave. That
You
was,
did.
I'm
You
very
did. It was
tired.
actually, I was like, ooh.
Really?
Yeah, you missed it. Yeah, I was like, I thought I was among royalty.
It
I
was,
try.
Yeah.
yeah, it was very white of you.
I was like first Rick Remender and now Matt Murphy. Yeah. Anyway, that was one of those quiet laughs where he wasn't really laughing. But thank you guys all for listening. Remember to go to comicsverse.com and